Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked drawer today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?
The Quincunx by Walter de la Mare. On opening the door, and in no good humour at so late and apparently timid a summons, I fancied at first glance that the figure standing at the foot of the 4 garden steps was my old and precious friend Henry Beverley, unexpectedly back in England again. At the moment there was only obscured moonlight to see him by, and he stood rather hummocked up and partly in shadow. If it hadn't been Henry, one might have supposed this visitor was the least bit apprehensive. "Bless my heart," I began, delight mingled with astonishment, then paused. For at that moment a thin straight shaft of moonlight had penetrated between the chimney stacks and shone clear into the face of a far less welcome visitor, Henry's brother, Walter. I knew he was living rather dangerously near, but had kept this knowledge to myself, and now, in his miniature car, which even by moonlight I noticed would have been none the worse off for a dusting, he had not only routed me out, but was almost supplicating me to spend the night with him, in a house which had, I heard with surprise, been left to him by an eccentric aunt, recently deceased, about 2 miles away. Seldom can moonshine have flattered a more haggard face. Had he no sedatives? Sedatives or not, how could I refuse him? Besides, he was Henry's brother. So, having slowly climbed the stairs again, with a lingering glance of regret at the book I had been reading, I extinguished my green glass-shaded lamp, the reflex effects of which may have given poor Walter an additional pallor, pushed myself into a greatcoat and jammed a hat on my head, and in a moment or so we were on our way, with a din resembling that of a van-load of empty biscuit tins. I am something of a snob about cars, though I prefer them borrowed. It was monstrous to be shattering the silence of night with so fiendish a noise, all the blinds down and every house asleep. On such a night. And as for poor Walter's gear-changing, heaven help the hardiest of army lorries. "Of course," he repeated, "it would be as easy as chalk to dismiss the whole affair as pure fancy. But that being so, how could it possibly have stood up to repeated rational experiment? Don't think I really care a hoot concerning the ghostly side of this business. Not in the least. I'm out for the definite. I'm dog-tired, and I'm all but beaten." Beaten, I thought to myself, not without some little satisfaction. But beaten by what? By whom? "Beaten!" I shouted through the din. We were turning a corner. "You see, for very good reasons I don't doubt, my late old aunt could not away with me. She found precious little indeed to please her in my complete side of the family, not even the saintly Henry. My own idea is that all along she had been in love with my father, and I, thank heaven, don't take after him. There is a limit to imbecile impracticality, and—" He dragged at his handbrake, having failed to notice earlier a crossroad immediately in front of us under a lamp-post. "She never intended me to inherit so much as a copper bed-warmer or the leg of a chair. Irony was not her strong point. Otherwise, I think she might have bequeathed me her wheezy old harmonium. I always had Salvation Army leanings. But fate was too quick for her, and the house came to me, the least beloved of us all. At first, merely out of curiosity, I decided to live in the place. But there's living and living, and there's deucedly little cash." "But she must have—" I began. "Of course she must have," he broke in. "Even an old misbegotten aunt by marriage can't have lived on air. She had money, it was meant, I believe. She mistrusted lawyers, for my cousin Arthur and the rest, and—" he accelerated, "I am as certain as instinct and common sense can make me that there are stocks, shares, documents, all sorts of riff-raff, and possibly private papers hidden away somewhere in her own old house, where she lived for donkey's years, where I am trying to exist now." He shot me a rapid glance, rather like an animal looking round. In short, I am treasure hunting, and there's interference. That's the situation. Naked and a bit ashamed of it. But the really odd thing is, she knows it. Knows what? She knows I'm after the loot, he answered, and cannot rest in her grave. Wait till you have seen her face, my dear fella, then scoff if you can. She was a secretive old cat, and she hated bipeds. Soured, I suppose. And she never stirred out of her frowsy seclusion for nearly 20 years. And now her poor Arthur is left gasping. She is fully aware of what her old enemy is at. Of every move I make, it's a fight past the death between us, and she is winning. But my dear Beverly, I began. My dear Rubbish, he said, squeezing my arm, I am as sane as you are, only a little jagged and peaked. Besides, I'm not dragging you out at this time of night on evidence as vague as all that. I'll give you positive proof. Perhaps you shall have some pickings. We came at length to a standstill before his antiquated inheritance, an ugly, awkward house. It abutted sheer onto the pavement. A lamp shone palely on its walls, its few beautifully proportioned windows, and it seemed, if possible, a little quieter behind its 2 bay trees, more resigned to night than even its darkened neighbours were. We went in, and Beverly, with a candle, led the way down a long corridor. The front room, he said, pointing back, is the dining room. There's nothing there, simply the odour of 50 years of lavendered cocoon, 50 years of seed cake and sherry. But even to sit on, there alone, munching one's plebeian bread and cheese, is to become conscious. In here, though, is the mystery. We stood together in the doorway, peering beneath our candle into a low-pitched, silent, strangely attractive and old-fashioned parlour. Everything within it, from its tarnished cornice to its little old parrot-green beaded footstool, was the accumulated record of one mind, one curious, solitary, human individuality. And it was as silent and unresponsive as a clam. What a fascinating old lady, I said. Yes, he answered in a low voice. There she is. I turned in some confusion, but only to survey the oval-painted portrait of Miss Lemure herself. She was little, narrow, black-mittened, straight-nosed, becurled, and she encountered my eyes so keenly, darkly, tenaciously, that I began to sympathize with both antagonists. Now, this is the problem, he said, making a long nose at it and turning his back on the picture. I searched the house last week from garret to cellar and intend to begin again. The doubloons, the diamonds, the documents are here somewhere. And as RLS said in another connection, if she's Hyde, then I'm Seek. On Sunday I came in here to have a think. I sat there in that little chair by the window, staring vacantly in front of me, when presently, in some indescribable fashion, I became aware that I was being stared at. He touched the picture hanging up on its nail behind him with the back of his head. So we sat, she and I, for about 10 solid minutes, I should think. Then I tired of it. I turned the old sphinx to the wall again and went out. A little after 9, I came back. There wasn't a whisper in the house. I had my supper, sat thinking again, and fell asleep. When I awoke, I was shivering cold. I got up immediately, went out, shut the dining room door with my face towards this one, went up a few stairs, my hand on the banister, and then vaguely distinguished by the shadow that the door I had shut was ajar. I was certain I had shut it. I came back to investigate and saw her. He nodded towards the picture again. I had left her, as I supposed, in disgrace, face to the wall. She had, it seemed, righted herself, but this may have been a mistake. So I deliberately took the old lady down from her ancestral nail and hid her peculiarly intent physiognomy in that cushion. Dare not, wild heart, grow fonder. Lie there, my love, lie yonder. Then I locked windows, shutters and doors, and went to bed. He paused and glanced at me out of the corner of his eye. I dare say it sounds absurd, but the next morning when I came down, I dawdled about for at least half an hour before I felt impelled to open this door. The chair was empty. She was up. A charwoman, I ventured. On Tuesdays, Fridays, and at the weekends, he said. You're sure of it? He looked vaguely at me, tired and protesting. Oh, yes, he said. Last night was my 5th experiment. And you want me? Just to stay here and keep awake. I can't, that's all. Theorizing is charming and easy, but the nights are short. You don't appear to have a vestige of nerves. Tell me who is playing this odd trick on me. Mind you, I know already. Somehow it's this old Shees who's responsible, who's manoeuvring. But how? I exchanged a long look with him, with the cold blue gaze in the tired, pallid face, then glanced back at the portrait, into those small, feminine, dauntless, ink-black eyes. He turned away with a vague shrug of his shoulders. Of course, he said coldly, if you'd rather not. Go to bed, Beverly, I answered. I'll watch till morning. We are, you say, absolutely alone in this house. Physically, yes, absolutely alone. Apart from that old cat, there's not so much as a mouse stirring. No rival heirs, no positive claimants. None, he said, though, of course, it's only my aunt. We stood in silence. Well, good night then, but honestly, I'm rather sceptical. He raised his eyebrows, faintly smiled, something between derision and relief, lifted the portrait from the wall, carried it across the room, leaned it against the armchair in the corner. There, he muttered. Check, you old witch. It's very good of you. I'm sick of it. It has relieved me immensely. Good night. He went out quickly, leaving the door ajar. I heard him go up the stairs, and presently another door above slammed. I thought at first how few candles stood between me and darkness. It was not too late to look for more. Not, of course, that I felt any real alarm, only a kind of curiosity that might perhaps leap into something a little different when off its guard. I sat down and began meditating on Beverly, his nerves, his pretences, his venomous hatred of, well, what? Of a dozen things. But beneath all this, I was gazing in imagination straight into the pictured eyes of a little old lady, already months in her grave. The hours passed slowly. I changed from chair to chair, TEG, gift books, albums of fading photographs, old picture magazines. I pored over some marvellously fine needlework and a few enchanting little watercolours. My candle languished. Its successor was kindled. I was already become cold, dull, sleepy, and depressed, when, in the extreme silence, I heard the rustling of silk. Screening my candle with my hand, I sat far back into my old yellow damask sofa. Slow, shuffling footsteps were quietly drawing near. I fixed my eyes on the door. A pale light beyond it began stealing inwards, mingling with mine. Faint shadows that zigzagged across the low ceiling. The door opened wider, stealthily, and a most extraordinary figure discovered itself and paused on the threshold. For an instant I hesitated, my heart thumping at my ribs, and then I recognized beneath a fantastic disguise no less tangible an interloper than Beverly himself. He was in his pyjamas, his feet were bare, but thrown over his shoulders was an immense old cashmere shawl that might have once graced Prince Albert's exhibition in the Crystal Palace, and his head was swathed in what seemed to be some preposterous 18th century night gear. The other hand outstretched, he was carrying his candlestick a few inches from his face, so that I could see his every feature with exquisite distinctness between his voluminous headdress. It was Beverly, right enough. I noticed even a very faint likeness to his brother Henry, unperceived till then. His pale eyes were wide and glassily opened, but beneath this face, as from out of a mask, keen, wizened, immensely absorbed, peered his little old enemy's unmistakable visage, Miss Lemure's. He was in a profound sleep, there could be no doubt of that. So closely burned the flame to his entranced face, I feared he would presently be setting himself on fire. He moved past me slowly, with an odd, jerky, constricted gait, something like that of a very old lady. He was muttering, too, in an aggrieved, queer, far-away voice. Stooping with a sigh, he picked up the picture, returned across the room, drew up and mounted the parrot-green footstool, and groped for the nail in the wall not 6 inches above his head. At length he succeeded in finding it, sighed again, and turned meditatively, his voice rising, a little shrill as if in altercation. Once more he passed me by unheeded, and came to a standstill, for a moment peering through the curtains a few inches withdrawn into the starry garden. Whether the odd consciousness within him was aware of me, I cannot say. Those unspeculating, window-like eyes turned themselves full on me, crouched there in the yellow sofa. The voice fell to a whisper. I think that he hastened a little. He went out and closed the door, and I'd swear my candle solemnly ducked when his was gone. I huddled myself up again, pulled up a rug, and woke to find the candle stub still alight in the dusk of dawn, battling faintly together to illuminate the little vivid painted face leaning from the wall, and that, on my soul, showing not a symptom of fatigue in this delicate spring daybreak, indeed appeared more redoubtable than ever. I sat for a time undecided what to be doing, what even to be thinking, and then, as if impelled by an inspiration, I got up, took down again the trophy from its nail, and with my penknife gently prized open the back of its gilded frame. Surely it had occurred to me it could not be mere vanity, mere caprice or rancour that could take such posthumous pains as this. Perhaps, ever dimly aware of it as he was in his waking moments, merely the pressing subconscious thought of the portrait had lured Beverley out of his sleep. Perhaps. I levered up the thin dusty wood. There was nothing beneath. I drew it out from the frame, and then was revealed, lightly pasted on the back, a scrap of yellowed paper, scrawled with 5 crosses in the form of a quincunx. In one corner of this was a large capital Italianate P, and beneath the central cross was drawn a small square. Here was the veritable answer before my eyes. How very like old age to doubt its memory even on such a crucial matter as this, or was it only doubt? For whose guidance had this odd quincunx been intended? Not for Walter Beverley's, that was certain. Standing even where I was, I could see between the curtains the orchard behind the house, pale in the dawn with its fast-fading fruit blossom. There, then, lay concealed the old lady's secret hoard. We had but to exercise a little thought, a little dexterity and precaution, and Beverley had won. And then, suddenly, impetuously, rose up in my mind an obstinate distaste of meddling in the matter. Surely, if there is any such thing as desecration, this would be desecration. I glanced at the odd, attentive face looking up at me, the face of one who had, it seemed, so easily betrayed her most intimate secret, and in some unaccountable fashion there now appeared to be something quite other than mere malice in its concentration, a hint even of the apprehension and entreaty of a heart too proud to let them break through the veil of the small, black, fearless eyes. I determined to say nothing to Beverley, watch yet again, and, if I could find a chance, dig by myself, and make sure of the actual contents of Miss Lemure's treasury before surrendering it to her greedy, insensitive air. So once more the portrait was rehung on its rusty nail. He was prepared for my scepticism, but he did not believe, I think, that I had kept unceasing watch. I'm sure, he said repeatedly, absolutely sure that what I told you last night has recurred repeatedly. How can you disprove my positive personal evidence by this one failure? By a million negatives? It is you who are to blame, that tough, bigoted, common sense of yours. I willingly accepted his verdict and offered to watch once more. He seemed content, and yet by his incessant restlessness and the curious questioning dismay that haunted his face, I felt that his nocturnal guest was troubling and fretting him more than ever. It was a charming old house, intensely still, intensely self-centred, as it were. One could imagine how unwelcome the summons of death would be in such a familiar home on earth as this. I wandered and brooded and searched in the garden, and found at length without much difficulty my Quincunx. The orchard was full of fruit trees, cherry, plum, apple, but the 5 towering pear trees, their rusty-crusted bloom not yet all shed, might become at once unmistakably conspicuous to anyone in possession of the clue, though not till then. But how hopeless a contest had my friend set himself with no guidance and one spade, against such an aunt, against such an orchard. Evening began to narrow in the skies. My host and I sat together over a bottle of wine. Much as he seemed to cling to my company, I knew he longed for solitude. Twice he rose, as if urged by some sudden caprice to leave me, and twice he sat down again in even deeper constraint. But soon after midnight, I was left once more to my vigil. This time I forestalled his uneasy errand, and replaced the portrait myself. I rested a while, then, when it was still very early morning, I ventured out into the mists of the garden to find a spade. But I had foolishly forgotten on which side of the midmost tree Miss Lumeur had set her telltale square. So back again I was compelled to go, and this time I took the flimsy, precious scrap of paper with me. Somewhere a waning moon was shedding light, for the mists of the garden were white as milk, and the trees stood phantom-like above the drenched grasses. I pinned the paper to the midmost pear tree, measured out with my eye a rough narrow oblong a foot or 2 from the trunk, and drove the rusty spade into the soil. At that instant I heard a cautious, minute sound behind me. I turned and once more confronted the pathetic, bedizened figure of the night before. It was fumbling with the handle of the window, holding aloft a candle. The window opened at length, and Beverly stood peering out into the garden. I fancied even a shrill voice called, and then, without hesitation, with the same odd, shuffling gait, Beverly stepped out onto the dew-damped gravel path and came groping towards me. He stood then, quietly watching me, not 2 paces distant, and so utterly still was the twilight that his candle flame burned slim and unwavering in the mist, shedding its small pale light on leaf-sprouting, flowerless bough and dewdrop, and upon that strange, set, haunted face. I could not gaze very long into the grey, unseeing eyes. His lips moved, his fingers, oddly bent, twitched, and then he turned from me. The large, pale eyes wandered to my spade, to the untrampled grasses, and finally suddenly fixed their gaze on the tiny square of fading paper. He uttered a little cry, shrill and desperate, and stretched out his hand to snatch it, but I was too quick for him. Doubling it up, I thrust it into my pocket and stepped back beneath the trees. Then, intensely anxious not to awaken the sleepwalker, I drew back with extreme caution. None the less, I soon perceived that, however gradual my retreat, he was no less patiently driving me into a little shrubbery where there would be no chance of eluding him, and we should stand confronting one another, face to face. I could not risk a struggle in such circumstances. A wave of heat spread over me. I tripped, and then ran as fast as I could back to the house, hastened into the room, and threw myself down in my old yellow sleeping place, closing my eyes as if I were lost to the world. Presently followed the same faint footfall, near at hand. Then, hearing no sound at all, and supposing he had passed, I cautiously opened my eyes, only to gaze once more unfathomably deep into his, stooping in the light of his candle, searching my face insanely, entreatingly. I cannot describe with how profound a disquietude. I did not stir until, with a deep sigh like that of a tired-out child, he turned from me and left the room. I waited a while, my thoughts like a disturbed nest of ants. What should I do? To whom was my duty obligatory? To Beverley, feverishly hunting for wealth not his, even if it existed, by else than earthly right, or to this unquiet spirit that I could not but believe had taken possession of him, struggling only I knew how bravely, piteously, and desperately to keep secret? What? Not mere money or valuables, or private papers, or personal secrets which might lie hidden beneath the shadow of the pear tree. Surely never had eyes pleaded more patiently and intensely and less covetously for a stranger's chivalry, nor from a wilder ambush than these that had but just now gazed into mine. What was the secret? What lure was detaining on earth a shade so much in need of rest? I took the paper from my pocket. Light was swiftly flowing into the awakening garden. A distant thrush broke faintly into song. Undecided, battling between curiosity and pity, between loyalty to my friend and loyalty to even more than a friend, to this friendless old woman's solitary, perturbed spirit, I stood with vacant eyes upon the brightening orchard, my back turned on the portrait and room. A hand, no man's, asleep or awake, touched mine. I turned, debated no more. The poor jaded face was grey and drawn. He seemed himself to be inwardly wrestling, possessed against possessor, and still the old bygone eyes within his own, across how deep an abyss, argued, pleaded with mine. They seemed to snare me, to persuade me beyond denial. I held out the flimsy paper between finger and thumb. Like the limb of an automaton, Beverley's arm slowly raised his guttering candle. The flame flowed soft and blue. I held the paper till its heat scorched my thumb. Something changed. Something, but just now there, was suddenly gone. The old drawn face melted, as it were, into another, and Beverley's voice broke out inarticulate and feverish. I sat him down and let him slowly awaken. He stared incredulously to and fro from the window to me to the portrait, and at last his eye fell on his extraordinary attire. "I say," he said, "what's this?" "Seemingly," I said, "they are the weeds of the malevolent aunt who has been giving you troubled nights." "Me?" he said, not quite free from sleep. "Yes," I said. He yawned. "Then I have been fooled," he said. I nodded. I think that even tears came into his eyes. The May morning choragium of the wild birds had begun, every singer seemingly a soloist in the enraptured medley of voices. "Well, look here," he said, nodding a stupid, sleep-drowsed head at me. "Look here. What, you think of an aunt who hates a fellow as much as that, eh? What do you think?" "I don't know what to think," I said.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked drawer today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?
That was the Quincunx by Walter de la Mare. And this is the part of the podcast where I talk about the story. I say something briefly about the author and then talk more about the story and my reaction to it, any thoughts that have spiraled off because of that, because of those reactions and impressions. You know, it's not mandatory. If you've got other things to do, don't worry, I'm not offended. But for those of you who are here, let's start. So Walter de la Mare was born in 1873 and died in 1956. He was English, and he's actually best known for his poetry and children's literature. He was born in Kent in England, began writing when he was very young. He often combines the supernatural with the ordinary, reflecting his interest in the mysterious and otherworldly. His most famous works include Memoirs of a Midget, 1921, The Return, 1910, and Collected Poems, 1942. His style is characterized by rich imagery, lyrical language, and a sense of unease or ambiguity. Start again, and a sense of unease or ambiguity. I'm sure you can recognize all of those elements in this story. He often explored themes of childhood memory and the passage of time. I think in this we're looking at the function of a ghost. Yeah. De la Mare received critical acclaim for his writing and won several awards during his lifetime. His influence on modern literature, particularly in these genres that we've spoken about, continues to be acknowledged today. So the Quincunx itself. It has an interesting publication history that spans several decades. It was first published in December 1906 in the edition of Ladies' Realm, a popular British magazine of the early 20th century. So this original version introduced readers to de la Mare's unique approach to ghost stories, and I think you will. I mean, the key factor in this story is that the ghost appears to possess its nephew rather than actually appear as an apparition, which is unusual. I'm not sure I've come across it at all. I mean, we have stories of possession, particularly much later, but not in this kind of way. Usually they're demonic, but this isn't. This is the ghost is trying to communicate. So, published in 1906, and then nothing happened to it. Didn't appear again until he revised the story in 1955 for his collection A Beginning and Other Stories. So he waited 50 years to revise it, and the revised version. You can look at both of those versions and compare them. Now, I don't have a copy of the early version. So the same revised version, which is one we've heard, was subsequently included in the posthumous collection Short Stories 1927 to 1955, published after his death, gathering up his short fiction. So what is a quincunx? There was a famous book by Charles Palliser called The Quincunx. I remember reading it. I remember buying it in Henley-on-Thames one day when I was there. And taking it home and being enthralled and being one of those books. This is Charles Palliser's book. I couldn't put down. So that introduced me to the idea of a quincunx, which is, it's hard to say. It sounds like quince, doesn't it? What was that line from a poem by Victoria Adams Edwards? Chewing on a kumquat, thinking of Keats. There you go. So there's nothing really, a kumquat has nothing to do with the quincunx. It just sound kind of similar to my sparky mind. So a quincunx is a geometric pattern consisting of 5 points arranged in a cross, with 4 points forming a square or rectangle and the 5th point positioned at the center. This arrangement resembles a 5-dot pattern found on dice or dominoes. So now you know when you're playing dice or dominoes, you can go, oh, that's a quincunx, and people go, you are. The term quincunx comes from the Latin words quinque, meaning 5, and uncia, meaning the 12th part, originally referring to a coin worth 5/12ths, as in ancient Rome, of an ass. Apparently, I don't know what an ass is. In various contexts, the quincunx pattern has symbolic, practical, or aesthetic applications. It's used in agriculture for efficient planting layouts, in heraldry as a decorative element, and in architecture for its pleasing visual balance. In literature and mysticism, the quincunx often carries deeper symbolic meanings, representing harmony, balance, or the 4 elements plus a central unifying force. You may know that the 4 elements are earth, water, air, fire, and the 5th is spirit. There you go. Now you know, if you didn't know before. And you may have known. So that is potentially relevant to this story. I don't know if de la Mare was making that point, but in this story, the quincunx pattern is a crucial clue linking the physical world with the supernatural. And guiding the character towards the hidden treasure, thus becoming a central motif in the narrative, so they'd never dig up the treasure, of course. The quincunx explores several interconnected themes, weaving a complex narrative that blends the supernatural with human nature. At its core, the story delves into the persistence of the past and its influence on the present. Okay, symbolized, sounds very Derrida, doesn't it? Hauntological, symbolized by the ant's lingering spirit and her hidden treasure. This theme is closely tied to the idea of unresolved conflicts and secrets, as the ant's unfulfilled desires and hidden wealth continue to affect the living long after her death. So what were her unfulfilled desires that are hinted at that she may have had a hankering for his father, the narrate, Walter Beverley's father. So that's her unfulfilled desire. She did not intend him to get the money. I think that's the point here. So we look at the role of ghosts in literature. The classic is revenge. Think of Hamlet's father. Then we have unfinished business, or a warning as well. Jacob Marley's ghost, yeah, guidance or protection, and the bloody baron in J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter, who helps Harry find the lost diadem of Ravenclaw, a symbol of guilt, as in Macbeth. I think is there guilt in this? Manifestations of grief, potentially. Portals to the afterlife, nah. Warnings or omens, no. Historical echoes, psychological projections and social critique. I think in this one, it's the classic unfinished business. There is something the ghost has not achieved. And of course, the spiritualists said that this is why ghosts hang around, because there are things that are not done that should be done, and whether that is, and it's often righting wrongs. So ghosts in literature and in folklore are very moral creatures. Not always, but often. And in this case, I think the wrong is she wasn't portrayed as a particularly nice woman, and we might psychoanalyze her, which we have no right to do really, because de la Mare doesn't do it. But we might say that she did have an unrequited love, or unresolved love for Beverley's father, Walter Beverley's father, and because of that, never married, and basically dedicated her life, wasted her life, if you like, hankering after a man she couldn't have. Maybe, we don't know that, but it made her quite bitter. And anyway, let's go on a little bit. Identity and possession. Yeah, Walter's possession, being possessed by his aunt. What's that about? And blurring of identities raises questions about the boundaries between the living and the dead. I think that's really interesting, and I think that we'd have to go a bit deeper than, de la Mare's story. We'd have to kind of try and guess what the unconscious of de la Mare was doing in putting this story together. And again, we have no right to psychoanalyze de la Mare either, but, people do it all the time. I think, given that he's dead, he may be looking down on me now. I'm a big fan of de la Mare. If you listen to my sleepy folklore, late night sleep radio, you'll have heard me quote from his book, Behold This Dream. I'm looking at it right now. So I love his poetic style, really, and this gently gothic-y, supernatural. It's never really particularly scary. It's just, I was reading a guy, one of these blogs, and he was talking about Thomas Ligotti's work, and he was talking about writing and saying, how we talk about literary fiction being character-driven, that we become interested in the characters, and genre fiction being narrative-driven, i.e. the characters are secondary, and we're really interested in what's going to happen, the plot. And he suggested that in Ligotti, given that the characters often aren't very nice, and the plot doesn't go anywhere, that we read them for the vibes. And I actually think that's right, I think a lot of this ghost stories particularly, and de la Mare perhaps more than most, we're just doing it for the vibe. We're doing it to be there and soak up the atmosphere and feel all kind of tragic and gothic, as I certainly do. But we started off this talk about psychoanalyzing Walter de la Mare, and I don't know the man. What is it about the ant, though, him appearing as the ant? He doesn't appear as a bog-standard ghost, which would have been easy to do. The two of them could have been in the house, and the man could have seen the ghost of the ant. He kind of sort of does through the picture. There's something kind of as if the picture itself is possessed by the spirit of the ant. And there are many stories. I'm thinking of Hugh Nisbet's The Old Portrait, but there's also The Eartonwood Ghost by Eleanor Glynn, and there's a portrait in that as well. So yes, ghostly portraits, but the fact there's not many stories that involve somebody dressing up as in the clothes of the dead person and being effectively possessed by them. That's unusual, and it's hard to know what that means, really. I don't know. If you have any ideas, let me know. Why? So the ant has. So what's the story then? The ant has. He's inherited the house, but he's apparently not a very nice guy. So the ant's reluctance to allow Walter access to a hidden treasure appears to stem from a complex web of personal history, character judgments, and posthumous desires. Throughout the story, it's suggested that the ant harbored a strong dislike for Walter and his side of the family, possibly due to unrequited feelings for Walter's father or a general disapproval of their character. I think they talk about it going to Walter says she probably intended it to go to Arthur and that side of the family. So, however, the antipathy is so potent that it seemingly persists beyond the grave, manifesting in the ant's spectral efforts to thwart Walter's treasure hunt. Indeed, he is definite there's money there, and he's going to find it. And she doesn't want him to. He's got the house, but she doesn't really want to have that. This is kind of supported by, when he first appears, and it's made very clear that the narrator doesn't really relish him coming. He likes the brother, but he doesn't and so there's a hint at Walter's disagreeable nature, although in the story, I made him talk very fast on purpose, but he wasn't particularly disagreeable. But he's a far less welcome visitor. So we've got a picture that this guy's not very nice, and this may be the reason why the ant, and he's greedy, he wants the money, and he's even called greedy and insensitive by the narrator. And so the narrator's growing sympathy for the ant's ghost as the story goes on. He moves from being a helper of Walter to find the treasure to actually being very sympathetic to the ghost and not Walter not getting it. So and he has an obstinate distaste of meddling in the matter. Perhaps it's not just spite, but a justified attempt to protect the ghost's legacy from someone she deems unworthy. The theme of worthiness and proper stewardship of inheritance is central to the story. Also, you see it as a role of ghosts as well. They are moral creatures, remember. And the bad, they punish the bad and unworthy people. They're kind of moral arbiters, almost like angels in some way. Maybe. But also family secrets. So there is a hint also that it's not just money, but there are some secrets that he isn't the right person to get access to. So he decides then to burn the clue, and the treasure is never turned up. I like the story. It's a simple story, really, in plot terms. It's nothing very elaborate or surprising about it, but the vibes are good, and the dressing up as the ant is perplexing, but I don't know what it means. But otherwise the story is very simple and not very groundbreaking, but it's got good vibes.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so? Isn't that so?